I started to see things in double. The things that were doubled were shifted 90 degrees such that things went sideways. They didn't go upside down, they went sideways. And eventually I lost the ability to communicate.
Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 51 of the Strokecast. This past fall, I read Christine Lee's memoir, Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember. It's the story of her 2006 stroke and the recovery that put her on the path she walks today. There are a bunch of themes running through this book, one of which is isolation, and the idea of intuition also plays strongly into her recovery. Christine lost her short-term memory as a result of her stroke, and she lost her ability to communicate. For the first time in her life, she had to learn to listen to herself and to trust her own intuition, to let go of the logical process of thinking about step by step of everything she needed to do, and trust that she knew how to do it. One of the things she talks about is before going to the hospital, before realizing she was having a stroke, her aphasia was setting in. She lost the word for egg and could only come up with shell bells. Now, I'm not minimizing the pain of aphasia here. I know it is terribly traumatic and it is a horrifying experience for folks to suddenly not be able to communicate. At the same time, there is something beautifully poetic about that word substitution, about how the brain works with concepts, and when it can't get to the right vocabulary, it comes up with something like shell bells as an alternative for egg. You can see several passages from Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember over at strokecast.com/Christine. After I finished the book, I reached out to Christine on Twitter and invited her to be on the show. I'm delighted that she joined us, and now I am thrilled to bring you this conversation with Christine Lee. But before we get into it, I realize we talked about PFOs a couple of times in this interview, but we don't actually explain it here. A PFO is a hole in the heart that between 25% and 33% of all adults have. Basically, it means that blood can pass from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart. And when it does that, it skips going through the lungs, getting cleaned up, having clots filtered out, and getting oxygenated in the process. It's actually one of the causes of strokes, when clots instead that would be removed by the lungs don't get that chance because they go right through the PFO. I talked about PFOs in greater detail and my experience with my own PFO back in an earlier episode, and you can find that over at strokecast.com/PFO. Christine Lee is the author of the stroke memoir, Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember, which was featured in the New York Times, Self Magazine, Time Magazine, and NPR's Weekend Edition with Scott Simon. Her short fiction essays have appeared in the New York Times, Zyzzyva, Guernica, the Rumpus, and BuzzFeed, among other publications. Her novel is Forthcoming from Ecco, Harper Collins. So now, let's meet Christine. Christine, thanks so much for joining me on Strokecast this week.
Thank you for inviting me. I was pleasantly surprised, honored to be here. Love reaching out to stroke survivors and telling my story in hopes that it will inspire people to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your book, and I want to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But first of all, let's start off with what was your life like before you had your stroke?
It just was a normal life. I had a day job, a 40-hour week job. It happened to be at a tech startup that my then husband and I had founded along with his friends. And it was just, work. There wasn't a lot of room for emotional investigation or reflection. And it was just a very ambitious life in that way. But, it was just, getting things done and being as aggressive as I could in the doing of them.
that's sort of a lot of that tech startup culture that goes along with that.
Yeah, especially in the early aughts and the 90s when it was just really getting started. I don't think even Google had just started up around then. And, we had a house, a mortgage, just, things looked very ideal.
Right. As you move forward, about to change the world.
Or so we thought, yes.
So what happened that day that you had your stroke?
So my stroke happened about almost exactly a year ago. I was excited to schedule this podcast with you on the anniversary of my stroke. It happened on New Year's Eve, 2006. And I basically woke up with a horrible headache. We were up in Tahoe for the holidays, and we were having friends over later that afternoon. So things were very busy. And I used to get migraines all the time. So we just thought it was a very strange migraine, but a migraine because I was 43 years old. I mean, not 40, I'm 33. Gosh, who has a stroke at 33? So we went about our day, at which point I started to manifest weirder symptoms. I started to see things in double. The things that were doubled were shifted 90 degrees such that things went sideways. They didn't go upside down. They went sideways. And eventually I lost the ability to communicate. I could say things, but they were coming very slowly in my mind, and I could feel myself separating from the world and I just felt like there were about 5 layers between me and the world. At which point I knew that something was wrong, but at which point I couldn't tell anybody what was wrong. Meanwhile, it's New Year's Eve and you're surrounded by 30-somethings who are just there to celebrate. So I got a little bit lost in the shuffle until about 3 days later.
Well, I guess first of all, happy 12th birthday.
Yeah.
It's really interesting how those sorts of things happen, and not directly relevant to your situation in this case, or maybe it is. But I think one of the challenges a lot of younger stroke survivors have is when symptoms like that start presenting themselves. A lot of folks may initially think, and especially if somebody is just encountering law enforcement or perhaps a less knowledgeable ER staff, that a lot of folks just assume, oh, this is a person who's on drugs or is just drunk, and don't actually take the problem as seriously as they need to.
Absolutely. And I think that really affected not only my diagnosis, but my treatment. I did happen to go to an amazing ER that has a stroke unit and was specialized in stroke. So while they thought it was vasculitis at first, I was pretty quickly diagnosed with stroke the next day after undergoing an MRI. But, during the course of treatment, I was just dismissed left and right. On top of my having had a stroke at a young age, the symptoms I exhibited were not classic stroke symptoms. Most of my deficits were cognitive and therefore invisible disabilities. So the fact that I had a 15-minute short-term memory, the fact that I couldn't absorb anything through auditory commands. If you said something to me, it immediately just blew out into the ether. And the fact that I had aphasia, all these things are invisible. When you looked at me, I looked completely normal. So when I was in speech therapy and occupational therapy, it was really hard for the therapist to recognize me as someone who truly needed help, because I didn't exhibit that way. There were no other symptoms that made me look disabled.
Right. A lot of the time they're focused on helping do safe transfers. They're focused on preventing shoulder subluxation. They're focused on how do they help you make it to and from the bathroom. How do they teach you to start using your arm again? Whereas exactly. An OT and a PT isn't going to be all that helpful with what you're with. Well, PT won't be nearly as helpful with what you're working through as speech therapy.
Right. And even if you do still have cognitive setbacks, it's these physical reminders that tell people, oh, you are not well. And I didn't have that. I am going to be the first to acknowledge that it was also a huge privilege because I could pass and I could sit in a room and not feel dismissed immediately. So I know that there are quote unquote advantages to having invisible disabilities. But, that's what delayed my trip to the ER. Not only was it the fact that I was 33 and I couldn't believe that I was having a stroke, but because I wasn't having any problems walking. I didn't have any problems lifting things. I didn't have problems, if you go through the fast symptoms, I could smile. And my face looked as it always did. I think the most visible issue was that I wasn't able to talk well, but even so, I could hold a very basic conversation.
Right. And it's nice to see the fast messaging starting to evolve into the be fast messaging to incorporate balance and vision changes and the eyes into the awareness symptoms.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. That's really great. Because, vision is a thing.
Yeah, exactly. The American Heart Association is still advocating fast, but more and more hospitals are promoting be fast.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, exactly. And, especially with younger survivors, I hear more and more that it's a balance thing or a vision thing that they know something is wrong first.
I think that it's like a fingerprint. Every stroke is different. Every stroke presents differently. One of the things that struck me, because I went to StrokeNet and got a lot of support during my recovery from the bulletin board there, was the fact that even though people might have had similar symptoms, there was still some differentiation between them. And in that sense, I think it's hard for stroke survivors to get the exact support they need because no two strokes are alike. So there's nobody who knows exactly what you went through.
And it becomes a lot more difficult to ask for the specific support you need if you're dealing with aphasia, and because the part of your body that is supposed to understand what's going on is the part that's broken.
Absolutely, yes.
What was your treatment generally like? What was that path to recovery from when they diagnosed your stroke?
Going through my stroke made me feel very alone because I was very alone, and it helped me be alone. I was dismissed throughout. I didn't get therapy appointments for weeks after my stroke, partly due to the medical system and the fact that they were booked, and partly due to the fact that I was regarded as somebody who isn't as critical, even though I couldn't balance a checkbook or write a cohesive sentence or remember a grocery list or read a map. By the time I went into occupational therapy, they didn't really know what they could do. So I think the most significant part of my recovery was the diagnosis and the support of my neurologist in the emergency room. And that's the person who was my constant throughout my recovery, who would encourage me and take measurements and assessments of my ongoing recovery, which in total took about 18 months. So I just did it myself. I just decided, you know what, I'm going to write every day, even if it's nonsense, because I took inventory even in my brain fogged state and said, what do I want to do most in my life? And what I wanted to do was be able to write again. So I wrote in my diary every day. I wrote on an anonymous blog every single day. I wrote my feelings down. Sometimes it would take me 4 hours to write one blog post. But that's the way I just took my own recovery into my own hands. And I don't recommend it for everyone, but I felt that that's what I had to do to get to where I wanted to be, because my definition of recovery was very different from the definition of the medical establishment.
Right. And I think what you say there is really interesting, is really important. When you talk about writing for hours every day, the core of doing anything in stroke recovery is doing those thousands of repetitions again and again, and doing that work regularly to drive those new connections that need to be built.
Yes, you're trying to bring, there's just neuroplasticity. I read about it later, and I just wanted to build those neurons and those connections back up again. It was to the detriment of my math. I used to be really good at math. I also happen to be East Asian, but I just didn't value it as much. And that's all I did is I just wrote nonsense words. I wrote in my moleskin at the time. I now love Leuchtturm, but I would write myself reminders and every single timestamp in the world. I think part of it is that in the hospital, because I had a 15-minute short-term memory, I wouldn't remember things. Doctors would come in and out of my room, and I wouldn't remember that they'd just been there 10 minutes prior, and we'd have to we'd have to do introductions over and over again. So one of the things that the neuropsychiatrist did was tell me to keep a memory log. And I had my notebook with me at the time, and I just would write timestamps down and who had come in and what had been said. And that became my short-term memory bank. And from that, I got inspiration to keep writing because it was so important to me to have that repository. And that was really key to my recovery, outside of also ultimately going back to my therapist and getting that emotional support.
A couple key things out of there. Now, I know how to pronounce Leuchtturm. I've been seeing that in all the bullet journal forums for forever, and I never actually heard it out loud. So thank you for that. I also think you said something really interesting there about how your stroke, it helped you to be alone.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
So I was somebody who always needed people around. I hated being by myself. And I also hated thinking about the present. I'm not very present oriented. I'm future oriented. And I think being alone has to do with focusing on your present state of mind. And being alone also has to do with listening to yourself. And because nobody was listening to me, because I couldn't communicate with other people, I was isolated and left with myself. And honestly, with regards to the first question, what was your life before the stroke? I don't think that I liked myself. And so being alone was very uncomfortable. And here I was with no other choice than to be by myself with my weird symptoms, my, recovery, my disabilities, and focus on what I could do in that moment. Mostly because I couldn't think about the future. I couldn't plan. That's in itself is a memory exercise. So because I had a 15-minute short-term memory, I just basically lived in 15-minute increments and listening to my gut, because I wouldn't know how to do things and I wouldn't know how to get anywhere. And so I listened to my gut, because every time I thought of a map, I would get lost. But as long as I let myself drive or let myself walk, I would get where I needed to be. And listening to yourself and your own intuition is a kind of being alone and listening to yourself. And those are all facets of being by myself and realizing that no one knew better what was best for me than myself, and that I could listen to advice all day long. But in the end, I had to find my own path. Of course, not go out and be abusive and self-destructive, but really be good to myself. Because for the first time in my life, I was listening to myself and being with myself in the present tense. So one of the biggest gifts of that stroke is that I learned to focus on myself and focus on the present tense and savor being alone.
One of the things you mentioned there, you talk about the idea of, if you tried to follow the map, it wasn't going to work. But if you just sort of trusted yourself to get there, it would work and you could get there. And I think that's one of those things too that's popped out at me as I learned to walk again, is that with a lot of folks, you can almost kind of mess them up by asking somebody who is able to walk how they walk. What is each step of walking? It's not about putting one foot in front of the other. It's about you contract this muscle to bend your calf back, lift up your toes, move your leg forward, swing it from this muscle. And once you start breaking it down and look at all of the details you have to do, you can't walk. You just can't assemble those motions.
And you never know what you were able to do until it's gone. That's when you know what something is. Like all of us take walking for granted. We've just been doing it since before we could remember. But once you lose the ability to walk, it becomes extremely clear what it involves.
Exactly. And like following a map versus intuitively going there.
Yeah, and telling a story. I learned that stories are told in modules because I would start telling a story and then I would lose the track of the story. And that was when I realized that stories aren't stored in our mind as one long narrative, but bits and pieces that we as humans weave together. And, nobody would know that unless you lost the ability to tell a story.
Right. And one of the things you talk about there, when we talk about stories, obviously this all feeds into the book you've written. As I read the book, one of the things that really stayed with me was how your aphasia was manifesting in those early days, and there was a certain beauty in the idea of shell bells, and that really just stuck with me. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I described eggshells as shell bells because that was the word that came into my mind. And to this day, I wonder, why can't eggshells be just be called shell bells? I don't know what I was conscious of at the time. I truly thought that was the word for eggshells. In hindsight, I have the same opinion as you do. I think that aphasia has a very beautiful language. And again, I think intuitive. I think it comes from an intuitive place. It's sometimes musical. It's very frustrating for the person having aphasia and the people who are trying to communicate with the person with aphasia. But it was just a symbol of that aloneness, of my own language being in my own world and manifesting in that kind of isolation. And I have a 5-year-old now, and I've watched her grow, and it's how language is learned. You make up words, and she has said that she has her own language and she makes up sounds. And I think it's the brain trying to make sense of things.
That imagery and that core meaning, that it exists completely separately from the language center, is one of those things that I think most folks don't even think about. But, as I talk with folks who've dealt with aphasia, a lot of it, the frustration comes from knowing what you want to express and having those thoughts and the ideas that are there, but not being able to connect to the words and the syntax to actually then connect with the physical act of speaking to actually convey that story.
Correct. Just again, you don't know what a thing does until it's gone. And it's the same thing with speech, that there are these complicated connections in your brain to produce the correct words in the correct order with the correct sounds. I even called my stroke a brain drain. One of the first things I did while having the stroke was put up a blog post on my anonymous blog. It happens to be jadepark.wordpress.com. And I called my stroke a brain drain. And that too is extremely accurate. But I didn't know what else to describe what I was feeling.
It's another one of those things you just, until you encounter it, you don't think about neurofatigue. You don't think about the idea of you can get tired just sitting there healing.
No, it took me 4 hours sometimes to write a blog post because it was exhausting. And it is a ongoing exercise for me because to this day I get easily exhausted. It's hard to explain. It's hard to explain that I just get easily exhausted these days. And the same things that would energize me before are draining now. And I could not believe how tired I was during my recovery. I was not that tired again until I had my daughter, at which point I had that same level of exhaustion. Except with my daughter, I was sleeping 3 hours a night, and after my stroke, I was sleeping 20 hours a day.
and that kind of makes a difference. So as you go through your recovery and you have your daughter, why did you decide to go ahead and write Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember?
I never planned on writing Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember. I never planned on writing a memoir. But after I had my daughter, my then husband left me, and he found someone else, and I didn't really know it until a little bit later. And I found myself again in a place where everything was gone, and that the landscape around me, or everything I'd known and had been familiar, was completely obliterated. So, in other words, I was devastated again. And once you go through, like for me, I just couldn't, it was so horrible that I couldn't look at it. And I found myself thinking about my stroke again for the first time in many years, and drawing lessons from my stroke to get me forward in my day-to-day life. I had, because I had postpartum depression and I was left with a newborn. I'd been married to somebody for over 14 years, together for 18, and suddenly he was gone. So again, I found myself turning towards my writing as well. And my friend asked me to write an essay for BuzzFeed. And I threw out a couple ideas. And until then, I'd not written cohesively about my stroke, but I'd wanted to for years. And I threw out the idea of writing about my stroke. And something about the context of going through a trauma and writing about a past trauma made it so that I could write about my stroke in its entirety. And it went on BuzzFeed. It went viral in, I think, October of 2015 or 14. And it got 500,000 views in 48 hours.
Wow.
And I am forever thankful to that opportunity, at which point editors and agents called me and asked me if I had anything written. And the thing is, I was a fiction writer. I had a novel manuscript nearly finished, but I had no intention of writing a memoir. And there we go. And that's life, right?
Right.
And then something else happens, and it's an opportunity, and you are living your dream, and it's in a way that you never thought it would manifest. I always tell people we have things manifest, but it will never come in the form you think it will. And so I'm living this amazing life today because of my stroke and because my husband left me. Who knew?
Right.
And so that's, I wrote my memoir in 12 months, and it was published in 2017. Like an amazing publishing house with amazing editors. Ecco, Harper Collins has been incredibly supportive of me.
And a lot of that early writing that you did as part of your recovery years before probably helped a lot, I would imagine, in giving you a base that you could draw stuff from.
Oh, yes. The reason that it's called Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember is that I felt that I was told to tell some people everything I didn't remember. And the diaries that I'd written and the blog posts I'd written were incredible resources for me to draw from for my memoir writing. I'm very thankful to the person I was for just being so thorough. I took tons of pictures as well, and I looked through all my medical records. So all of those came in handy. And so that's how that all helped me.
Wow. It's one of those things that's really interesting too, is just the impact of, the idea of having a camera phone with us all the time now. One of the things that I look back on my own recovery, and I am just about 19 months post-stroke now. And the improvements you see, you don't see them day to day. I don't think I'm that much better than I was now or a few months ago. But then I go back and I read the things I was posting to Facebook or look at the pictures that I had taken or the other commentary that I've made. And it's like, wow, that's where I can see it. And that's where I can see the story unfolding in a way that I couldn't when it was actually happening.
Yes, strokes recovery feels so slow. It feels so slow. I think the fastest part of it was that first month for me, but it was just so slow that I didn't really feel progress. But now that I look back, I can see the progress as well. And that's very gratifying.
You mentioned also being a woman of color. How do you think your ethnic background has impacted your recovery or your treatment in the medical system?
I mean, it does. It has impacted it greatly. And I bring up my upbringing in my memoir. And some people might wonder why it's even there. But I think that our childhood and all the lessons we've learned and the challenges we've overcome inform our recovery and how we navigate systems and processes and trajectories. So the fact that my parents were like tough as nails people who told me to just muscle through things, get over it, cope and persevere, helped me to, that's what part of why I took my own recovery into my own hands. That's why I reacted the way I did emotionally, which was to just be stalwart for the first 6 months and then collapse with, almost debilitating depression at a point where I was kind of stable. And so everybody's childhood informs them. But for me, I'm a pretty loudmouthed Asian woman, but, unfortunately, while I had my stroke, I was at a loss for words most of the time. And so I became a quiet Asian woman, which I normally am not. And I really had to be forceful, and my then husband had to be my spokesperson in getting me heard. It was everywhere from the first ER I went to a different ER who told me to just go home. And I remember my husband screaming and saying, but she can't remember anything and she can't talk. This isn't how she is. But they looked at me and said, what? I don't really see anything different than what I would expect. And that's how we ended up at the second ER, where I was listened to a little more because I wasn't surrounded by gunshot wounds and broken legs. But, I had to really scream to be heard throughout. And I think that I'm also privileged because there is a spectrum, and I may be a woman and I may be an Asian American woman with my own challenges. I would imagine it would be way worse if I were an African American woman who are traditionally more dismissed throughout in conversations.
And you talk about in your book also about living life with the PFO and how long and all the challenges that ended up causing. When you talk about having that, sort of being taught growing up to sort of suck it up and power through, do you think that also impacted why those problems weren't addressed earlier?
Absolutely. No one thought of it. What are you talking about? Why can't you run? Just go run faster. Because, my parents survived great atrocities and they survived immigration, which is a very traumatic experience where you just can't sit there and you can't lick your wounds. You don't have time to lick your wounds, and you don't have time to be sad, because if you're sad, then you're going to die. My mom once watched the movie Glory with me, and I know this dates me. And I remember Matthew Broderick and Carrie Elwes on the beach looking out into the horizon before they went into battle. And my mom's one reaction was, "They're going to die." And I'm like, what? It's a beautiful scene. There's orchestral music playing, and it's meant to make your heart swell. Because they're going to die. They're sentimental. They're just going to die. I just want to let you know. Don't be surprised. Lo and behold, I don't want to put any spoilers, but there was not a happy ending for those two. But that's sort of the sentiment. Like, you just don't have time for that. And so I wasn't allowed to whine. I couldn't run, but I had to focus on other things that I was better at doing. And eventually my PFO got closed, and then I got really, really angry because now I can run even after having not worked out. And I can't believe I had to suffer that much, and that I wasn't heard all that time, but and my mom feels really bad about it. But, I on the other hand, if it had been discovered when I was younger, I would have probably had to have had open heart surgery, which is a huge risk, given that, I was born in a different time period before, catheter cath labs could do such a thing.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing the procedures they can do now that they couldn't do 20 years ago.
Yeah, they'd have had to crack open my chest back then. And so that would have been a very different kind of process and outcome.
This was your first book, but it wasn't the first book you intended to write.
No, I'm writing a novel right now. So I had a novel in progress. I write fiction much more slowly than I write nonfiction. And so I'm under contract for my novel as well, which is being revised.
Also, is that something you've always wanted to do?
Yes, ever since I was a child. I was told that, because of who I was and where I came from, nobody wanted to listen to my stories. And I'm very gratified that the world has changed and made it so that people are interested in what I have to say and what a woman has to say and what a woman of color has to say and all of it. But I've always wanted to be a writer despite those roadblocks.
So you have that novel in development right now. Looking forward to that when that comes out. So what is your life like today? What deficits do you still deal with, and what does your day-to-day life look like?
Thank you for that. And my day-to-day life is very different than before. I cannot really work in an office 40 hours a week, so I try to work from home. I am extremely introverted, not because I like being introverted or it's my natural tendency, but because social interactions exhaust me, no matter how wonderful the person I'm with might be. And so I have to do very introverted jobs like writing if I'm in an office, I have to write or do something that's not group related. I used to be in HR. There's no way I can do that and talk to people all day. My auditory short-term memory is almost nil. I often do have to write things down. Well, no, not often. Let's be honest. I always have to write things down, or else I will forget what I've been told. So I will email myself off my phone, or I will write it down on a piece of paper, what the things that people have asked me to do are, or that I must do, or even an idea that comes into my head. But mostly it's those two things. There are other little things here and there. I think with physical issues, things have gotten a lot better since my PFO closure. I, knock on wood, don't get migraines anymore. And that has been an incredible development, because I used to get them regularly. And so, in some ways it's better, in some ways it's more challenging.
So what is one tip you would have for folks who are trying to live life with disabilities?
I think you have to find your tribe. I have to admit that I didn't understand disabilities before my stroke. I also teach. So after my stroke, I became very aware of all the ways that people do absorb information and the ways in which they absorb information more readily. And so as a teacher, I am now much more cognizant of invisible disabilities and learning disabilities, and make sure that whatever I'm saying in class is backed up with a visual on the board and is backed up with an activity in the classroom, so that people who have strengths in, whether they absorb information through auditory means, visual means, or kinesthetic means, gets what they need. And a lot of that is because I understand at last. And so you have to find your tribe, and it's very isolating. One of the horrible things about my recovery was that I did lose a lot of friends. not always by my own choice, sometimes by my choice, because people weren't giving me what I needed. And I had to really rebuild my social structure and really think about what I needed from friends. And there was huge fallout from that. But I got that rebuilt, and my tribe of people who really understand me has held me together. And I still am in touch with people that I met throughout my stroke recovery. One of them I just met a couple years ago after being online friends for over a decade. He is a brain cancer survivor and is someone that I forged a friendship with because his symptoms were very similar to mine, and, like friends for life. And you find them wherever you can.
And that brings us to our hack of the week.
Our hack of the week. So I have mentioned this several times throughout, but my hacks are going to be about cognitive disabilities. So I am all about writing things down, carrying a little notebook around with you and a little pen and writing it all in there. Or if you don't want that and you carry around a smartphone, email yourself. My email, and in the subject header, put a key word down like reminder or to do, so that later on you can search for them late. And instead of having to rifle through all the emails you've received, you can search through them for that keyword and bring up all your to-dos or reminders.
If folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
I'm very active on Twitter. I'm XteenHLee, XTINEHLEE on Twitter. And I have a website, ChristineHlee.com, ChristineHlee.com. And I'm there all the time. Reach out. I respond to DMs.
Awesome. And that's how we connected too, which was fantastic.
Yeah.
So Christine, thank you so much for joining us this weekend, for giving us that your precious energy and the social interaction over the last 45 minutes or so. I really appreciate your generosity there.
No, thank you for yours and for doing this podcast and giving me the opportunity to reach out to more people. It's been 12 years, and I can't believe the progress that's been made, and the ways in which a stroke has changed my life. And not to be Pollyanna about it, but there is a next chapter afterwards.
You can read more about Christine over at her blog. You can find those links in the show notes over at strokecast.com/Christine. Be sure to check out her assorted profiles and especially her Twitter. Read Christine's book, Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember. Pick up a copy from your favorite bookstore or library, or just look for it on Amazon. If you'd like to get a signed or personalized copy, you can order one from East Bay Booksellers. You can find details over on Christine's website. Share this episode with someone else who has gone through a stroke by giving them the link strokecast.com/Christine. Try writing things down and emailing yourself reminders so you can remember things. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.